Or consider this for just a second. This is Scala code. This is not Scala code in the sense that Scala has a built-in awareness of the relational database. These are actually functions that are taking parameters that will then turn into JDBC calls. How many of you could work with this? How many of you think this is a pretty natural and reasonable way to write SQL? How many of you prefer HQL? I mean, at the end of the day, every object relational mapping layer eventually has to create a query language because SQL is a very concise and terse way to express what we want out of a relational database. How about we forget trying to make relations look like objects, and how about we just treat them as tables and sets and tuples the way that the relational database thinks about them? So assuming that you've listened to me for the past hour and you say, yeah, I'm kind of fired up. This is really cool. I'm excited about the idea of languages. Now you get to the really, really hard part, which is, of course, convincing your boss. How many of you have one of those? Okay, if he's sitting next to you, you don't have to raise your hand, all right? The idiot boss shares two characteristics with every other idiot boss in the world. Number one, he knows nothing about building software. Yup, that's my boss. Yup, absolutely. And number two, he is absolutely convinced that his opinions on how to build software are correct. Yeah. How many of you have one of those? Yeah? Everyone's like, look, man, I'm tired of raising my hand. Just keep going. Two good reasons, two good approaches lend themselves to us in terms of using these custom languages. Number one, fortunately, these languages are genuinely useful. For example, building unit tests in Groovy or in JRuby is an absolute sight easier than doing it in something like Java or even Scala or C# if you're over on the CLR side of the world. Right? These dynamic languages make things much, much easier. They're particularly useful for sitting at the top of the stack for building user interfaces, hence the popularity of Rails, etc. And so you can go to your boss and you can say, look, we can cook up these unit tests in half the time, and we can make sure our code is that much more robust. And your boss might actually believe you. He might actually be smarter than you think, and he might go, you know what? Yeah, okay, sure. Let's do that, because at least now we're not putting that language into production. We can play with it for a while, figure out where the warts are. After one or two cycles of this, now we can start to think about deploying the dynamic language on top of our web framework, Groovy and Grails, for example, and go forward. If your boss is not swayed by that argument, you can also fall on reason number two, which is to say, most of the time, what your boss doesn't know can't hurt them. Most of these languages turn into .class files. And so he says, oh, okay, cool, we got a jar file, but I was rummaging around inside the source code control system. Yeah, right, your boss knows how to use CVS. Ha! But some of them do. And he says, I noticed we've got all these files ending in .scala. What is that? And you say, oh, that's just next generation Java. Java 7. We got an early build. I know somebody at Sun. Yeah, it's just part of, you remember they were talking about closures? Yeah, that's what it is. Don't worry about it. We'll rename them to .java at some point. As a matter of fact, the Groovy language will compile almost all .java files. So if you just go through and rename all of your .java to .groovy, it'll compile. And then from there, you can start eliminating things from your Java code and turning it into more powerful, more dynamic code. And your boss won't even know. It'll be happening right underneath his nose, and he won't even suspect a thing. The language renaissance is here. If you Google on languages Java VM, you will find a page that has over 200 entries. They're here. They're waiting for you to use them. But not just use them. In some cases, build your own. Build your own DSLs. Doesn't mean that you have to go off and create a Turing-complete language. As a matter of fact, Martin Fowler, who's working on a book on DSLs right now, will tell you that if you build a language that actually could be used as a programming language, you've gone too far. Back away. Step away from the technology for a second and build something simpler. Build languages that your users can use so that you get out of the business of having to constantly answer their need for new functionality. Let them build it themselves using their own DSL. And even if you don't go so far as to build a DSL, all of these tools are very powerful, very useful. You can use them in smaller ways, the so-called language-oriented programming approach. If you need to do some sophisticated validation, for example, and most of us will say, hey, if I can't represent it in a regular expression, I'm done. No, absolutely not. You can use tools like Lex, you can use tools like Yak, you can use tools like Antler and Gold to create far more sophisticated parsing systems that could be used as part of your validation. You could create an entry field. You could create a user interface that relies on users being able to say things like, buy 50 shares IBM at 50 US. And if you wire this up against an SMS system, people could start texting your system and entering stock trades. Because texting is turning out to be one of the very interesting forms of user interface. How many people have used Twitter? Twitter is what's known as a micro-blogging site. You SMS and it updates and it creates an RSS feed so that people can start sharing. It's tremendously popular right now in the US, almost as a sort of halfway between IM and email and blogging. SMS as an input format is very powerful. Build a DSL, build a language that people can use to send your system input over SMS or over IM or over any other sort of textual-based input, because at the end of the day, it's a heck of a lot faster once you know the language to just type it on a keyboard than to drag and drop and scroll the bar and click the button. We do that because we think our users aren't capable of understanding what we're doing. The truth of it is, they don't understand what we do in terms of programming, but they know their domain. Give them tools. Give them languages that let them go off and build their own systems and create their own functionality so that now you can get out of that game and start working on version 2 of the application. Okay, yeah, so you could start playing some more Quake, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're really interested in. Languages are definitely here to stay. Any questions? Okay, thank you.